work. Thanks, Marcel. Hello, thanks all very much for coming. Spare a thought for Marcel, who's got to listen to this talk for the third time. I'm going to try to vary it a little bit, put in some surprises. So the series of photos that you see here was taken at Casa Guidi in Florence, which was the home of Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning. You probably, most of you familiar, if you're English, you'll be familiar with Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning. It was a very famous romantic love affair, but if you're not English, then maybe I'll just summarize it quickly. So they were Victorian poets, Elizabeth, and she was considered an invalid, so she had a very strange youth and childhood, very closeted, and she spent a lot of time writing. She wasn't able to go to school, which she resented a great deal. All her brothers were sent off to school, so she was vigorously educating herself at home, reading a lot, becoming fluent in Greek and Latin. She became a poet very young. There's the largest collection of juvenilia in existence is by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which was actually published by her mother before she died. So they eventually, her family, her father and her siblings moved to London, to Wimpole Street, which is now the Westmoreland Heart Hospital. And the second part of this project was a residency I did at the Heart Hospital in last year. And it resulted in a film work which wasn't practical to show here, unfortunately, but there is an interesting connection between the Heart Hospital and the romantic love story. So Elizabeth was quite well known already. She was a published poet, and Robert Browning was completely unknown. He was 10 years younger than her. He admired her work and he started writing to her. And so their initial contact was all just through the written word, and they probably already sort of fell in love with each other before they ever met, which we're quite familiar with nowadays through internet dating. But in those days there was a very formal structure through courtship, and a lot of it was conducted really through family and your social context, and they were not suitable for each other because Robert Browning did not have the same social standing, and he didn't have any money, so he was not a suitable suitor for Elizabeth, and she would not have been allowed to marry him. And apart from the fact that her father actually didn't allow any of his children to get married, and in a weird, it seems a very sort of strange thing to us now, but I've been told by people who are more familiar with the period that actually being very overbearingly authoritarian was quite a normal behavior in fathers at the time. Elizabeth eventually met Robert. He came to visit, and it was probably a very chaste affair. They spoke, they walked out in Regent's Park, and they fell in love. And eventually they decided that they wanted to be together, so they married in secret at Marylebone Chapel. The chapel room dedicated to them is still there, you can visit it. And then they eloped to Italy together in the middle of the night with just the spaniel and the lady's maid as their companions, and they wound up here at Casa Guidi, which is furnished now as it was when they lived there, but it's not in fact all that authentic, because in between now and then it had been completely emptied and all the contents had been auctioned off, so it's a reconstruction in a sense. The interesting thing about house museums, I've worked a lot in house museums. I've done works with in the house of Lord Leighton in Kensington, in the house of Rudyard Kipling in Vermont. And the interesting thing with house museums is that there isn't anything very spectacular there. You're looking at a domestic, albeit often a very beautiful bit of real estate, but it's a domestic space, fairly ordinary objects, and really the thing that you're supposed to experience is the meaning of the object through the person who owned the object or used the object. So your imagination is very much required to participate in the functioning of a house museum. So the way I approached the project was that I spent a lot of time there and imagined how the rooms might be used, and imagined, you know, the ghosts that might be haunting the space. And I use dolls in my work. The figures are not real; they're life casts. So they're a little bit making a reference to the sort of waxworks that you might see at Warwick Castle. You know, the butler pouring the water in the bathtub, that kind of thing. So the waxwork is a sort of stand-in, sort of little form of animation in the space. I try to use that figure as a place, as a kind of occupant that's almost not there. So there's a kind of spectral quality to the figure, and that you can't really see them, you never see her quite face on. And I try to give that atmosphere of the place where you're not quite able to actually experience the person, but you're trying, or you feel like you're getting quite close. So it's all about the fact that we somehow feel closer to people in certain places, even though they're very long dead. The interesting thing about thinking about the romantic relationship between Elizabeth and Robert is that it illustrates in some ways the transformation of love relationships and romance since the Victorian times to now. There's a wonderful book by Eva Ilius called Why Love Hurts, which I recommend to anyone who ever thought about love. She talks about the way in which the formal courtship that used to happen, the way in which your family was heavily involved, and the way there was a lot of outside structure to courtship actually protected people's feelings in a sense, because when you were rejected because you came from the wrong family. Whereas nowadays, the marriage market, in a sense, anybody is a contender. Anyone and everyone could be a potential mate. There's no reason why they shouldn't be. And so when rejection happens, it's about the essence of the person themselves are rejected, which is a much more painful process. Elizabeth and Robert, to us, are very romantic because they went against their family will. Their love was so strong. They decided to to literally break with Elizabeth's family. Her father never spoke to her again until he died, which caused her great pain. A painting of his portrait was hung in the bedroom in Casa Gridi opposite the couple's double bed. So yeah, pain. But the interesting thing I think to think about is that we think of their love relationship in a way as being sort of quite contemporary, sort of maybe foretelling of our freedom, but there are significant differences. If we look at them now, we would say, okay, so Robert was 10 years younger and he married an invalid, so he must have been the sexually more attractive. He in a way was the one who made the bad match. But of course in those days it was her who made the bad match, because she should have been able to expect from her husband the kind of security that she would previously have had from her father. And in a way, there's the word sexy, for example, didn't really become a positive term until the 50s. It's something that emerged with consumer culture, the idea that you're satisfying your desires, that it's all about your desires, and the idea that love is primarily about sexual attractiveness, and that is what we use to choose our partners as a primary criterion. That would not have been the way, not saying that Robert and Elizabeth weren't probably very hot on each other, but that wouldn't have been the primary criteria for them. For them, it was a spiritual and intellectual union. Their compatibility was about their minds. Familiar to us anymore. And it's always interesting, I think, to think about how an artist's work fares over time. I did a big project in Budapest with monuments, the socialist monuments deposed in 1989, And that was the same kind of thought really occurred. Some of these artists were very important artists at the time. They had huge public commissions, and then, of course, due to political changes, their work became completely sidelined, largely destroyed. In fact, kind of lost even the role as being treated as art at all. And so that's something that I'm very interested in what happens to artists, because we are all tied into our time and we work within the context of our time, and in the future may dismiss what we do, or it may somehow fit into new narratives and continue. But there is really very little that you can know about that. And I think the dismissal of people is sometimes, I think people sometimes get dismissed too readily for being somehow unfashionable, or for being somehow associated with certain political or social or religious ways of thinking that we are no longer subscribed to. Even now, where we think about, in a similar way to how love has kind of become a bit like shopping, and that sort of, you know, art is also a little bit similar in the sense that anything and everything is possible so long as it will find a buyer. But I think that that nonetheless, if you look at the actual mechanics of art education, the process in which artists are developed and educated, that you'll find that there is a huge amount of ideology that comes into the making of artists in any era, even now, and that artists' practices are created in the context of the political system and the society in which they create. And so it's a nonsense to think about the artist as this kind of independent agent that sort of exists outside of and realizes his inner vision. Of course, that's part of it, but that's by no means all of it. Yeah, so I think that's probably all I was going to say about that. Maybe it might be interesting to know that these photographs were taken on analog film. I photographed them with a large format camera with plates, and they're also printed analog, so the negatives are, you know, gone in the enlarger and projected onto the paper. So it's a very old-fashioned method of making a print, which I love using because the way the image resolves is quite beautiful, and it's kind of in a way easier to replicate what you saw in the space. But it's obviously you can't manipulate anything. So because I work with dolls and figures, that can be a problem sometimes because they don't often behave in quite the way you'd want them to. But it's sort of worth it because I can be there on my own, and I don't have to be around people to make my work, which I prefer. Also, the technology would have been around when Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning were around, and I quite like that connection. Do you come in? The little bronze on the table is based on an artifact that exists in the Browning collection of Robert and Elizabeth's clasped hands, which I recreated. And the film work that I made is projected onto a Victorian fire screen, so you're going to have to imagine that, or hopefully there'll be an opportunity at some point to see that piece of work. Has anyone got any questions? Is there anything I missed out?
Well, I have a question. Just looking at your sort of past projects, they always involve either historical monuments, historical places, buildings. Sometimes you're looking at, like you said, the house of a famous person. How do you get inspiration for these projects? And is it more about the person or the building? Or?
I tend to start with the place or the object most of the time, and then I'll usually see a photograph or find the place interesting, and then find the person interesting, and then I do tend to do a lot of research. So I read a lot. I read as much as I could of Rudyard Kipling's work before I went to Norlaka, and also the biography, just because I feel like I'm looking for I'm looking for the ghost of somebody in a place where it clearly isn't really there. So I feel I have to bring that with me, and also the interest in the person often becomes quite intensified by becoming familiar with the place and the work. But I always do start with objects and places rather than with people. Except possibly I made a piece of work about Claude Cahun in Jersey, where she lived with her partner. She was a surrealist photographer from the 1920s, 30s. She was arrested by the Nazis, and there was very little of her. I couldn't, all I found was her gravestone, and that doesn't even carry her artist name. It has her birth name on it, so it took ages to find. So that was where I was really looking for somebody who wasn't there. There was no trace, and that was and it's visible in the work as well, in a sense. But I used a lot of her photographs, so I worked a lot with her photographs.
And do you have an idea what you'll be doing in New York along these lines? Are you going to be looking for historical buildings or people's houses, or you don't know yet?
I'm in New York for 7 weeks. I've got some teaching there, and I have a studio space. I'm not expecting to be, I'm actually bringing some work with me from the Citadel Spandau residency. I have a lot of photographs that I need to work on. So I'm not expecting to be, it's really, I mean, it wouldn't work, that I would just kind of turn up and go, you'd have to find a place, you'd have to meet the person who owns it, you'd have to talk about the project, and then maybe be invited back to do it at a later point. I'm very interested in monuments though, so I will be spending quite a bit of time looking at statues around New York, and whether there's anything that could be done there at the crack of dawn while no one's looking.
A slightly frivolous question. How do you travel around with your life-size dolls?
I have these
in the seat next to you.
Hey. I have these big rolly suitcases, and they're all dismantleable in pieces. So it's a challenge actually, moving them around. But it's fine. I quite enjoy it. They usually
open the case up at customs and you get this dismembered doll.
It only happened to me once in Morocco that they actually opened the suitcase at customs. They looked really unhappy,
Analogy between back to the wax model and the invalidity, do you think?
Yes, I mean the dolls always restrict, in a sense, what I can do with them. So they prescribe a certain amount of things, like it won't, stand up very easily, but so that's a kind of thing that is in all the work. But I did really want to have an intimate moment. I wanted to show an intimate moment where Elizabeth would be using the apartment, nobody would be there, and she would be alone, and she was apparently ill pretty much most of the time and lying down. So I looked for furniture that she would have been reclining and lying in and would have been using in that way. I thought it was also interesting that somebody would be so creative and write so much through so much pain and discomfort.